October 8th, 1871. It was a Sunday evening in Wisconsin. The air was dry, so dry it felt like even your breath could spark a flame. The wind, unusually fierce, howled across the fields like a warning no one wanted to hear. And above it all, the sky glowed a strange, angry red, as if the sun had forgotten to set, or something much worse had taken its place. In the small logging town of Peshtigo, nestled in the thick pine forests of northeastern Wisconsin, people were preparing for another quiet night. The churches had finished their sermons, dinner was being served in wooden homes, and children were being tucked into bed. But beneath the surface, something was coming. Something unstoppable. They called it the Peshtigo fire, though fire hardly describes it. It would become the deadliest wildfire in American history. Entire towns reduced to blackened earth in minutes. Over 1,200 people gone. Bodies turned to ash before they could scream. And in the middle of it all, a single man stood his ground, when everyone else ran. His name was Eliot Garrison. A farmer. A widower. A man who had every reason to flee, but didn't. While the sky burned and families screamed through choking smoke, Eliot refused to leave. Not because he wanted to die, but because of who he promised to protect. And what he believed in. When others grabbed what they could and ran for the river, he grabbed water buckets and ran straight into the flames. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why this man stayed behind, we need to go back. Not just to that night, but to the choices, the fears, and the quiet courage that led him to that moment. Eliot Garrison wasn't a hero. At least, not the kind who wore medals or gave speeches. He was the kind of man who woke up before sunrise, fed his animals before himself, and measured success by how much food he could store for winter, not how much gold he had in his pocket. His land wasn't big, but it was enough. Enough to raise crops, enough to shelter his sister's children after illness took her away, enough to live and die on. And that was enough for Eliot. But it wasn't enough for Franklin Hargrove. Franklin was everything Eliot wasn't: polished, wealthy, ambitious, and ruthless. He owned timber mills and railroad lines and had eyes on the land Eliot called home. To Franklin, Eliot's stubborn refusal to sell his property wasn't noble. It was an inconvenience. One that might soon disappear, if fate were to intervene. And fate, it seems, was ready to burn everything down. For weeks, northern Wisconsin had been in drought. The logging industry, booming and reckless, left behind piles of dry wood shavings, branches, and sawdust that blanketed the forest floor like tinder. Sparks from trains or campfires. No one knows exactly what started it, but the conditions were perfect for disaster. And on the night of October 8th, the wind changed. Suddenly. Violently. It roared out of the southwest like a freight train, pushing a wall of fire across the landscape faster than any horse could run. Trees exploded. Barns vanished in seconds. The fire didn't move like fire. It consumed like a living, breathing monster, tearing through the forest, fueled by wind and death and everything in its path. In Peshtigo, bells rang in panic. People screamed, grabbing whatever they could: a coat, a child, a prayer. They ran for the Peshtigo River, the only hope of escape. Some didn't make it. Others drowned. The water boiled near the banks. The air was fire. And while the town ran, Eliot stayed. He stood at the edge of his field, staring at the glow approaching from the west. Behind him, his wooden barn stood strong, but vulnerable. Inside it, for children slept. His niece and nephews, left orphaned when sickness took their mother. They were all he had left. And he wasn't about to let the fire take them too. He didn't hesitate. He didn't run. He went into the barn and started wetting cloths, wrapping them around the children's faces. He soaked burlap sacks, nailed them over the windows. He dug a trench in the dirt floor of the barn, deep enough to lie in. He'd read once that the earth was cooler below the surface. If fire came, that might be their only chance. Outside, the sky wasn't just red. It was burning. The wind screamed like it was alive. Sparks and embers danced through the air, setting dry grass ablaze in every direction. The silo erupted in flames. The animals screamed. A cow kicked through its stall in terror. Eliot tied a rope around the children's waists and pulled them into the shallow trench, covering them with soaked blankets, whispering through smoke, "Stay down. Don't move. No matter what happens." Then he waited, with firestorm all around him, with the world ending. And as the barn began to groan, as flames licked through the wooden beams, as smoke crushed the air from their lungs, Eliot Garrison, farmer, father by duty, fighter by instinct, held his ground. Because he'd made a promise. Because some things are worth staying for. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is not running away. Before we continue, if this story has caught your attention so far, take a quick second to like this video. It really helps more people discover it. We'd also love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We share powerful, real-life stories from the heartland that you won't want to miss. Alright, let's get back to it. Before the fire turned Peshtigo into a graveyard of ash and bone, before the rivers filled with bodies clinging to life, and long before his name would be whispered with reverence in towns that no longer stood, Eliot Garrison was just a man living on borrowed land with borrowed time. He wasn't born into wealth, nor did he seek it. What he built with blistered hands and unbreakable resolve. The farm had been his father's, carved out of the wilderness with blood, sweat, and the kind of faith that only the first pioneers of Wisconsin understood. That land meant everything. Not just because it fed him, but because it reminded him who he was. In the quiet days before the fire, Eliot's routine was sacred. Up before the sun. Feed the animals. Check the fencing. Tend the fields. He walked the same dusty path every morning, boots cutting through the tall grass, eyes on the horizon. And when the chores were done, he'd sit on the porch with a cup of bitter coffee, staring out at the barn his father built. It creaked in the wind, but it stood strong. Like him. After his sister died of fever in the spring, Eliot became a father overnight. For kids, all under the age of 10. They arrived with tear-streaked faces and only a single trunk of belongings between them. Eliot said nothing when the sheriff brought them by, just opened the door and nodded. They'd never return to the city. Not if he could help it. At first, the children feared him. He didn't smile. He didn't tell stories. He didn't tuck them in. But they watched the way he worked, the way he never raised his voice, and the way he always left an extra portion of stew in the pot after dinner. Over time, they understood. This man loved them, just not in the way they were used to. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast everything in gold, the youngest, Clara, asked him why he never went to church like the other farmers. Eliot paused, looked at her with tired eyes, and said, "Because I've already been to hell. I don't need to dress up on Sundays to remember it." That was Eliot. Blunt, wounded, and full of fire. But it wasn't just personal demons that followed him. Trouble wore a tailored suit and carried deeds in leather briefcases. Franklin Hargrove, the timber baron of the North, had a vision for Wisconsin. One where the land wasn't owned by the people who lived on it, but by the companies who stripped it bare. Franklin had tried to buy Eliot's land 3 times. Each offer came with more zeros. Each rejection came with fewer words. Eliot didn't care for promises of progress. He saw what Hargrove's expansion had already done to nearby towns: forests clear-cut, rivers polluted, families pushed out with nowhere to go. And Eliot knew, once you sell your land, you don't get it back. Ever. So when Franklin's men came a 4th time, Eliot met them at the gate with a shotgun in one hand and a quiet warning in the other. "You can take the road," he said, "but you'll leave the dirt." The men didn't come back. But word spread. In taverns and town halls, people whispered about the stubborn farmer who stood up to the richest man in the county. Some admired him. Others called him a fool. Franklin, on the other hand, said little. But he didn't forget. Then came the drought. By late September, the ground was so dry it cracked underfoot. Wells dipped low. Rivers turned sluggish. Trees wilted. Fires were already common, little ones. Contained. Brushed off by locals as part of life near the woods. But Eliot noticed the change. The wind didn't feel right. The air hung heavier. And the forest had gone too quiet. On October 1st, Eliot started making preparations. He dug trenches around the barn. Cleared brush that hugged too close to the house. Stacked buckets near the well. Neighbors laughed, said he was being paranoid. But Eliot didn't care what they said. He'd learned long ago that when the world feels wrong, it usually is. 7 days later, his instinct would prove horrifyingly accurate. But in those final days before the fire, life moved on as if nothing was coming. Children played in the fields. Franklin hosted a party at his estate. The train lines carried lumber, and the mills buzzed with activity. No one saw the signs. No one wanted to. Except Eliot. And maybe deep down Franklin too. Because Franklin had begun drawing up new maps. Maps where Eliot's farm no longer existed. Maps that led to railroads and sawmills and profit margins. And as the wind picked up and the skies turned orange, Franklin's silence grew. He didn't warn the towns, didn't halt the logging. He just watched. And Eliot? He tightened his boots, sharpened his tools, and checked on the children more than usual. He stayed later in the barn, sat longer on the porch at night. And every now and then he'd walk out to the edge of his property, stare into the distant woods, and mutter, "Not yet, but soon." He wasn't scared. Not in the way others would be. Because Eliot Garrison didn't fear fire. He feared leaving things undone. And when the fire came, it would find him ready. Not with power. Not with an army. But with a promise. And a will as unshakable as the land beneath his feet. There are moments in history when everything changes, not with warning, but with wind. Sunday, October 8, 1871, began like any other day in northeastern Wisconsin. The sky was cloudless, the sun harsh and sharp. A strange quiet blanketed the land. Birds didn't sing. Animals didn't graze. And for those who paid attention, like Eliot Garrison, something felt wrong. Deeply, undeniably wrong. By late afternoon, the air grew hot. Not warm, hot. The kind of heat that makes skin prickle and sweat bead before a single movement. People stepped outside their homes and looked toward the western horizon, where the light seemed too bright, too golden, as if the sky itself was glowing. Then the wind came. Fast. Wild. Like nothing anyone had ever felt before. Not a breeze, not a gust, but a force. Trees bent backward. Hats flew. Doors slammed. Dust swirled. The animals panicked first. Dogs howled. Horses pulled against their reins. Chickens scattered. Then came the smell, smoke thick and sharp. Not the gentle scent of a distant campfire. This was choking, bitter, heavy. And in that moment, something clicked in the hearts of everyone who smelled it. It wasn't just smoke. It was the beginning of the end. Miles away, the firestorm had already begun. Ignited by the perfect storm of dry brush, human negligence, and unnatural winds, it tore through the forest like it had been waiting all summer to be born. Flames didn't crawl. They leapt. They sprinted. Eyewitnesses later described trees exploding from the inside out, the sap boiling and bursting from within. And the wind, oh the wind, it didn't push the fire. It fed it. It spun it into a cyclone of flame. A literal fire tornado, rising hundreds of feet into the air, hurling embers and ash miles ahead of the main blaze. In Peshtigo, chaos erupted. Church bells rang, not for worship, but warning. People ran into the streets, clutching children, trying to decide what to grab, what to leave, where to go. Some sprinted for the river, thinking water meant safety. Others tried to outrun the flames by horse or foot. None of it mattered. The fire was faster. It outran horses. It outran prayers. Inside Eliot's farmhouse, the children stared at him, wide-eyed, sensing the panic even without understanding the full weight of what was coming. Clara asked, "Is it thunder?" Eliot knelt beside her, his face covered in soot and sweat, and said, "No, sweetheart. It's the fire." He had no time left. Only decisions. First, the animals. He opened every stall, every gate. Let them run. It was mercy. Then the barn, his second priority, now first. That's where they'd take shelter. He'd already dug the trench days ago, half thinking it was overkill. Now it was their only hope. He gathered the children, wet towels, and what few blankets he could soak in the trough. He wrapped the kids up tightly, told them to hold hands and follow him. Outside, ash was falling like black snow. Sparks whipped across the sky. The sun had disappeared behind a curtain of smoke. It was still daylight, but it looked like midnight. Then came the sound. Not the crackle of fire. Not the roar of wind. A scream. Not human. Not animal. It was the sound of the forest itself dying. Trees toppling. Buildings combusting. An entire town howling in pain as it was consumed. And still, the wind grew stronger. Eliot knew he had only minutes. They reached the barn, and he hurried the children into the trench, laying soaked blankets over them, whispering, "Don't move. Don't breathe deep. Don't be afraid." He poured more water over their heads. The wood around them creaked and groaned. The fire was almost here. Back in town, Franklin Hargrove stood on the porch of his estate, watching the inferno like a man watching the future unfold. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He simply stared, lips pursed, eyes calculating. The wind blew his hat away. He didn't flinch. His entire empire was at stake, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized the fire didn't care who you were. It didn't care about titles or wealth or railroads. It was blind. Unstoppable. Absolute. In Peshtigo, people threw themselves into wells, into rivers, into ditches. Parents covered their children with their own bodies. The lucky ones died quickly. The others did not. And still the fire came. The Peshtigo River filled with the living and the dead. People clawed for space in the mud, gasping through the smoke. Babies screamed. Mothers held them tighter. One survivor would later write, "The river boiled near the shore. We couldn't touch the water. It was safer in the flames." And Eliot? Eliot lay in the dirt with 4 children pressed against him, the earth around them scorched, the barn above them beginning to catch. Flames licked through the walls. Smoke thickened. The blankets steamed. One of the children whimpered. He held them tighter, teeth clenched, eyes shut, praying without words. Not to be saved, but to hold on just long enough. The wind screamed like a train through the barn doors. The air glowed orange. And time stopped. In those moments, when breath burned and the world collapsed, Eliot's mind returned to a promise. One he made to his dying sister. Protect them, Eliot. No matter what. Don't let them end up like us. And he hadn't. Not yet. Because Eliot Garrison wasn't going to die running. He was going to survive standing still. By the time the flames reached Eliot's land, Peshtigo was already lost. Not burning. Gone. The fire didn't spare, it devoured. Streets, homes, people, memories, all swallowed by a wall of heat so intense that iron tools melted, that glass fused into the ground. It wasn't just a firestorm. It was annihilation. A city erased in a single night. And while hundreds of families had no time to scream, while the river filled with the desperate, Eliot Garrison lay in a hole carved into the barn floor, holding the shivering bodies of 4 children against his chest. Above him, the barn crackled, roared, splintered. The air burned to breathe. Smoke poured in through the boards like black rivers, rolling across the ceiling before sinking lower and lower. He kept his eyes closed. Not to block out fear, but to focus. Every breath was a battle. Every second, he checked for movement. For life. One hand gripped Clara's arm. The other pressed a soaked cloth over Samuel's face. Beneath him, he could feel the earth tremble as the fire swept across the land like a god set loose. There was no time. No past. No future. Only survival. Outside, the world was dying. Trees snapped in half, their trunks glowing like red lanterns. Embers the size of fists flew across the sky, setting fires where none had been. Ash fell like snow, so thick it blanketed the land. Cows ran until they collapsed, their bodies blistering before they hit the ground. The heat was not natural. Survivors would later say the fire made sounds they couldn't describe, like thunder cracking inside their own heads. And in the middle of this hell, Eliot remained. Because he knew something no one else did. Running was no longer safety. It was suicide. Only the earth could shield them now. So he pressed the children deeper into the trench, soaked the blankets again and again, even as the water turned warm, then hot. The well was nearly dry. The roof groaned, the timbers above them glowing at the edges, bending, cracking. He whispered the only thing he could think to say. "Stay down. Don't open your eyes. We're going to make it." And still the fire screamed. Back in town, people jumped into barrels of rainwater. They crawled into cellars and dug holes with bare hands. Franklin Hargrove's estate was gone in under 10 minutes, consumed like it had never existed. He had made it to the river, his fine coat burned, his face blackened with soot, standing shoulder to shoulder with the same people he once dismissed. He didn't speak. Not a word. Because what could he say? All his money, all his power, all his maps and plans gone. The fire didn't care that his name built railroads. It didn't care that his men cut forests for progress. It didn't care who he was. It erased him just like it erased everything else. And in that moment he knew. He'd misjudged the one man who refused to sell. Eliot Garrison wasn't stubborn. He was wise. The wind that carried death was not just a tragedy. It was a reckoning. And Eliot had prepared not because he feared loss, but because he refused to surrender. The barn's roof finally gave way. A beam crashed just feet from the trench. Flames licked the dirt. The children cried, coughing through rags soaked in muddy water. Eliot threw his body over them, shielding them as embers rained like knives. And then silence. Not peace. Not safety. Just the sudden, awful silence that comes after destruction. The fire had passed. And what it left behind was a world unrecognizable. The barn was gone. The house was gone. The fields were black. Eliot opened his eyes, vision blurred, lungs raw. He could barely lift his head. But he could hear them. The children. Still breathing. Still alive. He pulled back the steaming blankets. Their faces were streaked with soot, but their eyes blinked open. Clara reached for his hand and whispered, "Is it over?" He nodded. "Yes. For now." They climbed out of the trench like ghosts. Around them, the land looked like the moon. Nothing green. Nothing standing. Only bones of trees and broken fences and scorched earth that smoked beneath their boots. But they were alive. They were among the very few. And that mattered. More than crops. More than barns. More than anything. Eliot didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just looked at the sky, now gray and heavy, and let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like years. Because in a night where entire towns vanished, he had held on. Not just for himself, but for 4 small souls who needed someone too stubborn to die. The fire took everything. It took homes. It took churches. It took farms and fields, horses and harvests, fathers and mothers and children too young to understand why the sky turned black and the ground turned red. But what it left behind was worse. It left silence. A silence so thick, it rang in the ears like a scream that never ended. A silence born not from peace, but from absence. Absence of voices. Absence of life. Absence of everything that once made the town of Peshtigo a place filled with laughter and light and song. On the morning of October 9th, 1871, the fire had passed. But the nightmare hadn't. Survivors crawled from mud holes and riverbanks like ghosts returning to a world that no longer recognized them. Their skin was blistered, their clothes burned to rags. Some had no hair, no shoes, no strength. They stumbled across the landscape with ash-covered faces and hollow eyes, calling out names that would never be answered again. And there, among the wreckage, stood Eliot Garrison, barefoot, covered in soot, holding Clara's hand, with the other children gathered silently around him. His barn was gone, his farmhouse leveled. The fences, the fields, the orchard he'd planted with his father, all of it had vanished beneath fire and fury. But somehow, he and those 4 children had walked through the end of the world and come out the other side. Barely. In every direction, nothing but ruin. Skeletons of wagons, melted tools, cows lying on their sides, their bodies twisted mid-run, trees blackened down to the roots, and silence still. No birds, no insects, just the soft crunch of ash beneath feet. They didn't cry. Not yet. Grief hadn't caught up to them. It was still moving, slower than the fire, but just as certain. And when it arrived, it would come without mercy. Eliot looked to the sky. It was gray, thick with smoke that refused to lift. No sunlight broke through. Only a dim, muted glow that washed the world in tones of bone and charcoal. He didn't speak. Not until Clara asked, "Where do we go now?" He didn't have an answer. So they walked. South, toward where Peshtigo had once stood. Eliot knew it wouldn't be there anymore, not really. But he needed to see it with his own eyes. Needed to understand the scale of what had happened. The children followed without question. There was nothing left to follow but him. As they moved through the wasteland, they passed people. Just a few. Blackened faces. Silent stares. Some dragging the dead. Some digging with hands in the dirt, searching for jewelry, for photos, for anything left behind that still mattered. But nothing survived. Not really. The fire had moved too fast. In less than an hour, it had done what war couldn't. It had leveled a thriving town, destroyed thousands of lives, and written itself into history without leaving time for anyone to blink. And no one saw it coming. They reached what had once been the main road. Eliot recognized it only by the iron signpost, half melted, that once pointed to Green Bay. A woman sat nearby, cradling a child that didn't move. Her eyes stared through Eliot as if he weren't real. Further down the path, Franklin Hargrove stood in the ruins of his dream. His fine coat had burned away. His boots were gone. His face was raw and peeling from the heat. He looked like any other man now. No wealth, no power, no maps or promises. Just skin and smoke and guilt. He saw Eliot, and for the first time said nothing. There was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to take. The fire had leveled them both. Different men, different reasons, same result. But only one of them had something left worth protecting. Eliot walked past without a word. And Franklin, once a man who spoke in commands and contracts, lowered his head. They reached the edge of what used to be Peshtigo's church. All that remained was a scorched foundation and a blackened iron cross, twisted by the heat. Around it lay charred hymn books, half-melted candlesticks, and the remnants of dozens who thought God's house would save them. It didn't. The fire had no boundaries. It respected no prayers. It spared no sanctuaries. Eliot knelt and picked up a small crucifix, still warm. He held it in his palm for a long time before handing it to Clara, who clutched it tightly. It was the first thing they'd found that hadn't turned to ash. They camped that night beneath a sky that no longer felt like theirs. The stars were hidden behind smoke. The wind was dry, bitter. Eliot made a fire, small, controlled, ironic almost, and held the children close. For the first time, they wept. Not because they were afraid, but because now they knew they had survived something that had taken nearly everyone else. And surviving comes with its own weight. In the days that followed October 9th, 1871, Wisconsin became a graveyard without headstones. The fire had passed, but its shadow lingered. There was no wind now. No sound. Only the dry crunch of footsteps over ash. People moved like survivors of war, except there had been no army, no generals, no warning. Only wind and flame, and a silence that wrapped around everything like a shroud. Eliot Garrison didn't talk much in those first days. He didn't need to. The children were quiet, too changed. Even Clara, who had always been the one to ask questions, had nothing left to say. They followed him as he walked through the ruins of the only life he had ever known, past what used to be neighbors' homes, now just burned outlines in the soil. Ashes don't lie. They tell you who was standing where. They tell you who ran and who didn't. You could see it in the strange shadows left behind. Shapes of furniture burned into the ground, outlines of bodies that never made it to the river, the warped remains of lives interrupted mid-movement. There was no beauty in the destruction, only truth. And that truth was heavy. But Eliot carried it. One step at a time. He led the children away from the worst of the ruins, past the scorched churchyard and the mill that once employed half the town, now just a twisted mass of metal and silence. Every path they took was coated in ash. Every tree they passed looked like a skeleton with its arms reaching up, begging the sky for mercy that had never come. It wasn't long before federal aid teams arrived from the east, men in clean uniforms with clipboards and cameras, sent to record what had happened, to measure the scale of the catastrophe, to make sense of it. But what they found defied sense. 1,200 confirmed dead. Entire families erased. Hundreds more missing. Burn zones stretching over 1.2 million acres. And in the middle of it all, a man and 4 children who should not have survived. Reporters asked Eliot how he did it. He said, "I didn't. The earth did." They didn't understand. They were looking for a story about bravery. He gave them a story about dirt and wet blankets and listening to your gut. He wasn't interested in being a hero. He was interested in building something that wouldn't burn. Franklin Hargrove survived too, but he was not the same man. The newspapers didn't mention him by name. No one was interested in the rich timber magnate who lost everything. No one wanted to hear about the mansion that vanished in 10 minutes, or the empire of wood that turned to smoke. Franklin tried to speak with Eliot once. Just once. He found him standing near the remains of Eliot's barn, hammering together a makeshift shelter with salvaged boards and bent nails. Franklin didn't recognize the man at first, his beard singed, his hands blistered, his clothes in tatters. He cleared his throat and said, "You were right. About all of it." Eliot didn't look up, just kept hammering. Franklin waited. Then Eliot finally said, "People died because men like you thought the land was theirs to use up." Franklin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There was no comeback. No defense. He walked away without another word. Ashes don't lie. They remind us of what we really built, and what we lost trying to build more. The aid workers set up camps near the river. Tents went up. Food was distributed. Water was rationed. But comfort was harder to come by. Many of the survivors didn't want help. They wanted answers. Why had no one warned them? Why had the fire moved so fast? Why had it taken their children, their homes, their entire world? There were no answers. Only ash. And Eliot knew that rebuilding would be a different kind of fire. Slower. Quieter. But just as consuming. He started with the fence. Not because it was necessary, but because it was symbolic. A line between ruin and recovery. Between what was lost and what was still possible. Every morning, before the sun rose, he was out there digging post holes. The children helped quietly, methodically. They didn't complain. They didn't ask why. They just worked. Because work was the only thing left that made sense. Sometimes people passed by and watched them. Some offered help. Some offered food. A few just nodded and kept walking, their faces still too stunned for words. But Eliot didn't need their sympathy. He needed lumber. Nails. Seeds. A reason to stay. And he had it. 4 of them, actually. At night, around the fire, he would tell stories, not to entertain but to remember. He spoke about their mother. About the orchard they'd replant someday. About the way the seasons used to feel before everything burned. And the children listened. Because the fire had taken their home. But not their future. It's easy to imagine that once the flames die out, the story ends. But sometimes the most difficult part of survival isn't outrunning the fire. It's what comes after. The days when no one is watching. The weeks when grief has settled into your bones. The months when all you have is a scarred patch of land, a few tools, and memories that still sting like smoke in your lungs. For Eliot Garrison, the fire hadn't ended on October 9th, 1871. It had only changed shape. The physical flames were gone, but a new kind of fire burned inside him now. Not rage. Not grief. Purpose. The kind that doesn't shout but simmers. The kind that keeps you standing even when your legs beg you to sit. The kind that makes a man rebuild a life out of nothing, not because he believes he'll succeed, but because he refuses to let failure be the last thing he leaves behind. Each morning, Eliot woke before the sun, his body aching but his will unshaken. He sharpened old tools, scavenged nails from burned buildings, repurposed scraps of iron. He taught the children how to check the soil for life, how to recognize when ash could nourish and when it would poison. He showed them how to measure hope with their hands. The land wasn't kind, not at first. The topsoil had been scorched, and the rains that followed turned the ash to sludge. But they kept digging, kept planting, kept trying, because Eliot understood something that most had forgotten. Fire may destroy, but it also clears the way. It burns away what is dead so something else can take root. One fence post at a time, the new life began. And it wasn't just Eliot. Across the county, other survivors started emerging from the fog of loss. Farmers who had buried family members now stood beside strangers, rebuilding homes. Children who had seen too much clung to whatever stability they could find. Entire communities, reduced to blackened skeletons, began taking shape again. But not everything returned. Some chose never to come back. Too much had been lost. Too many ghosts lived in the soil. Eliot never blamed them. He just stayed. And in doing so, became something no one expected, an anchor. People began to seek him out. Not because he had answers, but because he had endurance. They came for advice, for seeds, for help rebuilding fences. He gave what he could. Sometimes it was just a strong back and a quiet hand. He didn't charge. He didn't preach. He just helped. Because somewhere deep down, Eliot believed that the only way to honor the dead was to build something worth living for. One day, a government man rode in from the east. He carried a list of names, those confirmed lost, those still missing, those who had been reported dead but hadn't been found. He stopped at Eliot's property and asked if anyone had seen 4 children by the names of Clara, Samuel, Thomas, and Anne. Eliot nodded. Then he pointed to the field. "They're planting corn," he said. The man blinked, then crossed 4 names off his list. "That's rare," he muttered. "Most we ask about, they don't turn up." Eliot just replied, "Sometimes it's not luck. Sometimes it's staying put when everything tells you to run." The man looked at him, clearly not understanding, then tipped his hat and rode on. Later that evening, Clara sat beside the fire, staring at the small wooden cross she'd kept since the ruins of the church. She asked, "Uncle Eliot, why didn't the fire take us too?" Eliot didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because something in this world still needed us." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The fire had tested them, reshaped them, and left them standing. Not unbroken, but stronger where the breaks had been. By spring, green returned. Tiny blades of grass pushed up through the scorched earth. Wildflowers appeared along the edge of the new fence line. The orchard was gone, but one stubborn apple sapling had survived in the shade of a fallen tree. The children called it the lucky one. Eliot just smiled and said, "Luck's got nothing to do with it." He didn't believe in miracles. He believed in roots. In work. In promises made and kept, even when no one else is watching. The newspapers eventually moved on. The tragedy faded into paragraphs. History books would later cover the Great Peshtigo fire in a few pages, sometimes less. Most people would never know the full weight of what had been lost, or what had been found in the ruins. But for Eliot and the children, and those who returned to rebuild, it would never be just history. It was personal. A before and after. A fire that didn't just take lives, but changed them. And from that fire, a new kind of life had begun to grow. Rebuilding after fire is not like starting fresh. There is no clean slate, no sense of new beginnings. The ghosts remain. The outlines of what used to be are everywhere. Every step you take is a reminder of who didn't get to take it with you. And that's what Eliot Garrison lived with every single day after the fire. The land around his rebuilt fence didn't just hold roots and soil. It held stories. It held silence. It held names he'd never forget, and faces he sometimes saw in dreams. The barn he was putting back together? It stood in the exact same place where he once laid in the dirt, for children clutched beneath him, waiting for the roof to fall. Every nail he hammered echoed a memory. Clara once asked him, "Why don't we build it somewhere else?" Eliot didn't pause. "Because we didn't die here. We lived." He understood something the others were still learning. You can't erase pain by moving away from it. You can only grow around it. More survivors began returning that spring, their footsteps tentative at first, their expressions hollow. Some found the strength to start over. Others stood where their homes used to be, broke down, and left for good. Rebuilding wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about what you could carry in your heart and still keep moving forward. Eliot carried plenty. Every morning, he visited the stump of the old oak tree near the edge of his property. Before the fire, it had been the tallest tree in the area, a landmark, a place where his father once carved his name. Now it was just a blackened pillar, charred but still standing. He'd stand there in silence, sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer. He never said why. But the children watched. And they knew it wasn't grief that brought him there. It was memory. The past wasn't something Eliot wanted to forget. It was something he wanted to keep close, so he'd never let it happen again. Meanwhile, the world beyond Peshtigo moved on. Trains ran again. Timber companies returned cautiously, this time with new safety codes, better clearing methods, a fear of lawsuits and public shame. Franklin Hargrove was no longer among them. He had disappeared in the weeks after the fire, sold his remaining interests, left no forwarding address. Some said he moved east. Others claimed he'd gone mad. A few believed he wandered into the woods one night and never came out. No one looked for him. But Eliot thought about him sometimes. Not with anger. Not even blame. Just a question. Had the fire changed him? Or had it simply revealed who he'd been all along? Either way, it didn't matter anymore. Franklin Hargrove was gone. But the trees were growing back. Slowly. Quietly. As if the forest was teaching them all how to begin again. And life, in its strange way, continued. One afternoon, a stranger arrived on horseback. A thin man in a dark coat with a long scar down his jawline. He dismounted without a word and approached Eliot as he was working the fence line. "You Garrison?" he asked. Eliot nodded. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "From Chicago. From a lawyer. You've been named the legal guardian of those 4 children." Eliot didn't flinch. "I already was." The man blinked, nodded once, and left without another word. That night, Eliot sat with the children around the fire, roasting potatoes in tin foil, listening to the wind through the new grass. Clara asked, "Does this mean we're a real family now?" Eliot looked at her, the firelight catching the gray in his beard. "We were always real." He didn't say much more. He didn't need to, because the truth was already in the way he handed out plates. In the way he made sure and never got the smallest piece. In how he counted the stars every night before sleep. In how he sat up with Thomas when nightmares came. Love doesn't always speak. Sometimes it just stays. Sometimes it rebuilds fences and plants corn and teaches a child to tie a knot. Sometimes it survives fires. That summer, crops began to take root again. Modest but promising. A few ears of corn. Some beans. A scattering of tomatoes. Eliot didn't celebrate, but the children did. They danced barefoot through the rows, laughing for the first time since the fire. And Eliot smiled. Just a little. Because the fire hadn't taken everything. It had left behind something worth protecting. And that was enough. There's something strange that happens after great tragedy. When the dust settles and the fire's gone, people expect life to simply go back to how it was. As if you can sweep away ashes and pick up where you left off. As if trauma doesn't leave fingerprints on everything it touches. But Eliot Garrison knew better. You don't go back. You climb. Slowly. Painfully. Relentlessly. one foot above the other, through the weight of everything you've seen. And sometimes the light at the top isn't even visible. But still you climb. That's what the months after the fire felt like. Not survival. Not peace. Climbing. Every day brought new obstacles. The soil was unpredictable, and crops came late. The river, still tainted with soot and debris, gave less fish than before. Storms rolled in often, as if nature was trying to clean the slate, but doing it violently. Trees creaked. Winds howled. The children sometimes froze at the sound of thunder. Because to them, loud meant danger now. To Eliot too. He didn't say that out loud. But the look in his eyes during lightning storms told the truth. His hand would tighten around his coffee mug. His jaw would lock. He'd stare at the sky like he expected it to burn all over again. But he never let it stop him. He kept working, kept teaching, kept protecting. Because climbing meant you don't look down. You don't stop to count how far you've come. You just keep going. The barn was the first real sign of progress. Built by hand. No blueprints. Just Eliot's memory and instinct. It wasn't as big as the old one, but it was stronger. Reinforced. Fire-resistant siding. Stones around the foundation. A lookout hatch in the upper loft. The kids helped. Samuel learned how to measure boards. Clara learned how to drive a nail. And became an expert at fetching tools. And Thomas, well, he mostly got in the way, but Eliot never scolded him for it. Because Thomas had stopped having nightmares. That was enough. One day, while repairing the roof, Eliot looked out across the field and saw something unexpected. A figure. Distant. Watching. He climbed down and approached cautiously. It was Franklin Hargrove. Thinner. Older. But unmistakable. He held a satchel and wore a threadbare coat. No hat. No horse. Just boots covered in mud. "I brought this," Franklin said quietly, opening the satchel. "Inside papers. Deeds. Titles. Property transfers. I'm giving the land back," he said. "All of it. To whoever's left." Eliot stared at him, saying nothing. Franklin cleared his throat. "I don't expect forgiveness." Still, Eliot was silent. "I just needed to do one thing right before I die." That was when Eliot spoke. "Then don't talk about dying. Talk about staying." Franklin blinked, surprised. "I don't belong here anymore." "You didn't belong here before," Eliot replied. "But maybe now you finally do." And then he turned and walked away, back toward the barn. Franklin didn't follow. But he didn't leave either. He camped nearby that night. And the next day he stayed. He helped rebuild a neighbor's shed. Shared salt pork he'd carried from the next county. Told stories around the fire to children who had never heard his voice before. And when people asked Eliot if they should trust him, he simply said, "He's still here, isn't he?" Because climbing is lonely work. And maybe everyone deserves a second chance to reach the summit. By the time the one-year anniversary of the fire arrived, October 8, 1872, the land looked almost familiar again. Not the same, but something new that resembled what had once been. The fences stood taller. The fields stretched wider. The trees, some scarred, some young, swayed in the breeze. And in the center of it all, Eliot Garrison's farm stood like a monument. Not just to survival, but to refusal. Refusal to surrender. Refusal to forget. Refusal to let fire be the last thing that touched this place. On that anniversary, Eliot didn't speak. Instead, he walked to the tree stump at the edge of his property, the one that had refused to fall, and he carved 5 names into the blackened bark. One for each of the children. And one for himself. Below it, he carved one more word. Still. Because they were. Still growing. Still standing. Still climbing. And in a world that had once turned to flame and smoke and silence, that was more than enough. The strangest thing about trauma is how long the world takes to catch up. Long after the fires have stopped burning, long after the smoke has cleared, it's still there, lingering in the quiet moments, hiding in the corners of your mind, waiting in the sounds that remind you of when the sky turned red. But on the morning of September 29, 1872, nearly 1 year after the fire, something happened that no one expected. The sky cried. It started as a whisper, a gentle breeze through the trees. Then slowly a drop. Another. A sprinkle across the roof of Eliot Garrison's new barn, soft as breath, almost afraid to fall. And then, with no warning, it came rain. Real, heavy, unstoppable rain. The kind of rain that soaks through your clothes in seconds. The kind that makes rivers out of roads and turns silence into song. The kind of rain that feels like a cleansing not just of the land, but of the soul. Eliot was in the field, checking the last of the fall corn, when it hit. He looked up, blinked into the clouds, and for a long moment just stood there. He didn't run for cover. He didn't call the children. He just let it happen. Let it wash over him. The children saw him from the house and ran outside, arms spread wide, laughing in a way that hadn't been heard in months. They danced, spun, slipped in the mud, their faces lifted to the sky like flowers finally getting what they'd begged for. And Eliot, he laughed too. Not a chuckle. Not a smile. A deep, unfiltered, chest-shaking laugh that came from somewhere buried beneath all the soot and silence. It was the sound of something breaking loose. The sound of something healing. Because the fire had come without mercy. It had taken and taken and taken. But the rain? The rain asked for nothing. It just gave. Later that evening, with steam rising off the roofs and puddles gathering at every corner, Eliot sat on the porch with Franklin Hargrove. They shared a jar of preserved peaches and a silence that was different now. Less heavy, more human. Franklin took a long breath and said, "I used to think fire was the worst thing that could happen to a man." Eliot looked at him and replied, "It's not." "What is?" "Wasting what's left afterward." That night, Franklin didn't sleep in the barn. He slept in the house, at the children's insistence, and gave him a quilt she'd sewn herself. Clara brought him warm milk. Thomas asked him to tell a story, and though Franklin had never told stories before, he made one up about a wooden man who learned how to plant trees. It wasn't a good story, but it made Thomas laugh. And in that moment, it was more than enough. Outside, the rain kept falling. Not in anger. Not in warning. But in relief. Like the sky had held its breath for too long and finally let go. Over the next few days, the land transformed. The ash that had once choked the soil became soft again. Patches of green broke through the black. Flowers bloomed along fence lines. The air smelled different, rich, alive, full of promise. People from nearby towns came to see the Garrison farm. They brought supplies. Some brought animals. One man arrived with a crate full of bees, saying, "If there's honey here next spring, we'll know this place is truly back." Eliot simply nodded, because he'd never asked for anyone to believe in him. But now they did. Even the ones who once called him stubborn. Even the ones who once tried to take what was his. Now they looked at him and saw something else. Not a farmer, not a survivor, but a man who refused to let destruction have the final word. The state government sent officials to Peshtigo that fall. They asked questions, measured losses, drafted new safety policies. Eliot met with one of them, a young man with polished shoes and a too-tight collar. "We're here to make sure this never happens again," he said confidently. Eliot shook his head. "It will happen again," he said. "Somewhere. Different fire. Same mistake." The man didn't know how to respond. But he wrote it down. Because Eliot didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. By October 8, 1872, the world had begun to turn again. The anniversary of the fire came quietly. There were no speeches. No parades. Just small, personal moments. A candle in a window. A prayer at a grave. A whispered name in the dark. At the Garrison farm, the children gathered at the stump of the old oak tree. Clara placed 5 stones in a circle around it, one for each of them, and tied a ribbon around the base. Samuel stood in silence, eyes closed. Thomas asked, "Do we have to remember it every year?" Eliot crouched beside him. "No," he said. "But we should." "Why?" "So we know what we're made of." That night they built a fire in the hearth, not a wild one, not a fire to fear, but a fire of warmth. A fire of memory. A fire that meant home. And as the flames danced behind the glass, the rain finally stopped. But this time, the silence it left behind was peaceful. The kind that doesn't weigh you down. The kind that gives you rest. Time is a strange thing in places that have known fire. It moves forward, yes, but it never quite forgets where it's been. By the spring of 1873, the Garrison farm was almost unrecognizable. Not because it had gone back to what it once was, but because it had become something new, something entirely its own. Stronger. Wiser. Deeper. It had grown not just crops, but meaning. The fields, once buried in ash, now carried rows of green. Rows Eliot had planted by hand with the children at his side. The barn stood proud again, stronger than the first. A chicken coop clucked with life. The fence stretched wider than ever before. And in the center of it all was a hill, gentle, round, and until now untouched. That's where Eliot chose to plant the orchard. Not just trees. Names. He didn't call it a memorial. He didn't believe in monuments made of stone or signs that fade in the rain. He believed in things that could grow. So he planted one tree for every family he remembered. Every neighbor. Every friend. Every soul lost in the fire. There were 57 trees in all. Each one marked by a small wooden sign, hand-carved, pressed into the soil beside the roots. The children helped him write them. They didn't know all the names, so Eliot told their stories as they carved. Not long speeches. Just a memory. She baked the best rye bread in the county. He once chased a bear off with a broom. He gave me the first hammer I ever owned. No one was forgotten. Because memory, when planted right, doesn't rot. It blooms. As spring turned to summer, word of the orchard spread. People came, quietly, reverently. Some brought flowers. Others brought nothing at all. Just silence and tears and the weight of old names on their tongues. There was no admission, no ceremony, no instructions. You came. You walked. You remembered. The trees were still young, their branches thin and leaves small. But they stood, and in the wind, they whispered like old souls finding their voices again. Eliot never asked for thanks. But he got it anyway. One afternoon, a woman approached him near the gate. Her hands were rough. Her eyes red. "You planted my father," she said softly. "Third row. Fourth tree." Eliot looked her in the eye and nodded. "Good tree," he said. She smiled, tears welling, and whispered, "Thank you." He just tipped his hat. Because what else could you say? The orchard became more than remembrance. It became a gathering place. A place where weddings happened under the branches. Where children were named beside the signs of those who came before. Where people spoke freely, cried openly, and allowed themselves to feel again. Even Franklin Hargrove came once. He didn't say much. Just walked the rows with a blank expression, stopping now and then to touch a sign, to read a name, to close his eyes. When he reached the edge, he stood still for a long while, then turned back to Eliot and said, "I wish I'd known them better." Eliot replied, "You still can." That day, Franklin began helping maintain the orchard. Watering, clearing weeds, fixing signs that fell in storms. No one told him to. He just did it. Not for forgiveness. But maybe for peace. Because peace isn't something you wait for. It's something you work for. Clara once asked Eliot why he never carved his own name into one of the signs. He looked at her, smiled faintly, and said, "Because I'm not done yet." And she laughed. "Then we won't be either." The orchard changed with the seasons. In spring, it bloomed with soft pink and white blossoms that filled the air with a scent sweeter than memory. In summer, it shaded picnics and prayers. In fall, it dropped fruit that children collected in baskets. In winter, it stood bare but never dead. Just waiting. Just holding on. Because that's what it had been built to do. One afternoon in late July, Eliot stood at the top of the hill, watching the sun fall across the rows. The light made the trees look golden. Alive. Eternal. He closed his eyes and listened. Not for fire. Not for silence. But for wind in leaves. For laughter far below. For the soft creak of branches reaching upward. And he whispered, still here. Because he was. And because now so were they. Years passed. Not in the way you noticed them. Not all at once. But in the little things. In the way a child's voice deepens. In the way a path gets worn smooth by footsteps. In how trees grow without asking your permission. Time has its own rhythm. And on the land that once burned, it was finally beginning to sing again. By the spring of 1883, the Garrison orchard was no longer just rows of young saplings. It was tall now. Strong. A canopy of green where children ran, lovers walked, and elders sat beneath the shade of names they still remembered. The Garrison farm had become a place people pointed to when they spoke of resilience. Not because it had the biggest harvest or the newest machines, but because of what it stood for. What it refused to forget. The fire, even after all that time, was still there. Not in flames. Not in smoke. But in memory. In choices. In the echo it left behind. You could still feel it in the way people moved during dry summers. In how they kept buckets near the porch and scanned the horizon when the wind picked up. In the way they taught their children that nature wasn't something to conquer, but something to respect. Eliot Garrison grew older, his back bending, his beard going white. But he never left the farm. Never took the easy path. Never once thought of leaving. He walked the same paths every morning. Checked every tree. Fixed every fence. He taught the children, now grown, how to read weather patterns, how to plant by moonlight, how to build things that would last longer than they did. One day, Clara, now a young woman with her own ideas and her mother's fire, asked Eliot a question while helping repair the barn roof. "Uncle, do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Eliot paused, the hammer still in his hand. "I wish it hadn't taken so much," he said. "But I don't wish away what it left behind." "What do you mean?" He looked out over the fields. "It left us with truth. With each other. With a chance to rebuild the right way. Most people don't get that. Clara sat with that for a long time. So did the rest of us. Because sometimes the most powerful parts of history aren't the fires themselves, but the hands that rise from the ashes. The people who decide not to be erased. The stories that survive because someone refused to stop telling them." Eliot's story wasn't one of perfection. It was one of grit. Of scars. Of patience. He didn't want glory. He didn't need monuments. What he wanted, what he spent his life building, was a place where fire could never take everything again. A place where echoes didn't haunt but teach. Where legacy wasn't a statue, but a row of trees growing strong into the sky. Eliot passed away in the winter of 1889. Peacefully. In his sleep. Surrounded by the only family that ever mattered. He was buried on the hill, beneath the old oak stump that had survived it all. And next to it, the orchard continued to bloom, season after season, whispering his name in the wind. Visitors still come. Some from nearby towns. Some from across the country. They don't always know what happened there, not at first. But they feel it. In the stillness. In the strength of the trees. In the way the sky seems to breathe just a little differently above that land. They learn about a man who stayed when everyone ran. About a promise made to 4 children. About a town that burned but never vanished. And about the fire that tried to end everything, but didn't. Because some stories don't die. They live on, passed hand to hand, heart to heart, seed to soil. They echo. And if you listen closely, you can still hear Eliot's voice in the rustle of the orchard leaves saying, "Still here." Now it's your turn. Tell us what you took from this story. What lesson do you carry forward? What truth do you think is essential for a human life? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. And if this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember that from even the worst fires, new life can rise. You're watching Wisconsin Farm Tales. Thank you for being here.